Why was this German Shepherd on trial? And what shocking truth would it reveal about the very man holding the gavel? Justice had never seen a case like this before. A police officer stood by, ready to defend the dog, but when a secret from the past unraveled, the entire courtroom gasped. Would this be a verdict of redemption or betrayal? The city was wrapped in an unforgiving winter, its streets blanketed in thick layers of snow. The air was so cold that each breath turned into a visible mist, dissipating into the darkness of the night. The courthouse stood as a solemn, towering structure at the end of the empty street, its grand steps covered in a thin layer of ice. It was silent, save for the occasional howling of the wind, which carried an eerie stillness through the desolate roads. Under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a lone German shepherd lay curled up near the courthouse entrance. Its fur was matted and unkempt, patches of black and tan barely visible beneath the frost that clung to its body. Its ribs were faintly outlined beneath its coat, a silent testament to the hunger it had endured. The dog's eyes, deep brown pools of quiet suffering, stared blankly ahead, as if resigned to the harsh reality of its existence. The wind howled through the street, sending sharp gusts of snow swirling through the air. The dog shivered violently, its paws numb against the frozen pavement. It had wandered for days without shelter, surviving on scraps, dodging cars, avoiding cruel hands. But tonight, exhaustion had won. It no longer had the strength to run. A pair of headlights pierced through the swirling snowfall, illuminating the courthouse steps. The low hum of an engine rumbled as a police cruiser pulled up. The driver's door swung open and a tall figure stepped out. Officer Jake Donovan exhaled sharply, his breath forming a brief cloud before vanishing into the night. His boots crunched against the icy ground as he adjusted his coat, shielding himself from the biting cold. He had spent years patrolling these streets, and nothing surprised him anymore. Homeless men seeking warmth in alleyways, petty thieves lurking in the shadows, he had seen it all. But tonight was different. His sharp blue eyes landed on the shivering form near the courthouse entrance. A dog. Stray by the looks of it. Jake sighed, shaking his head. Another one, he muttered to himself. He had seen plenty of strays roaming the streets, but there was something about this one that made him pause. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply lifted its head, locking eyes with him. And those eyes. They weren't just filled with fear. They held something deeper, something almost human. A silent plea. Jake frowned, his instincts kicking in. He had seen eyes like those before, in victims, in survivors, in people who had been abandoned and left to fend for themselves. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle the dog. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. "What are you doing out here?" The dog didn't respond. No growl, no bark, just quiet acceptance. It wasn't the first time Jake had rescued an animal off the streets. He had a soft spot for them, much to the annoyance of his precinct. "You're a cop, Donovan, not a damn animal shelter," his partner would joke, but he never had the heart to ignore them. Still, this one was different. It didn't cower, it didn't run, it just sat there, waiting. Jake shrugged off his heavy coat and carefully draped it over the dog's frail body. He expected it to recoil, but instead the dog barely reacted, just a slight shift, as if the warmth was something unfamiliar. "You're freezing," Jake murmured, his voice softer now. He reached out, hesitantly brushing his fingers against the dog's cold fur. Still no reaction. Jake clenched his jaw. He couldn't just leave it here. With a deep sigh, he made his decision. "All right, come on," he said, more to himself than the dog. Carefully, he slid his arms under its frail body and lifted it. The dog tensed for a moment, but when it realized he wasn't going to hurt it, it relaxed against his chest. Jake could feel its slow, weak heartbeat against his own. God, how long had it been out here? He carried the dog to his cruiser and gently placed it on the passenger seat. Snowflakes melted on its fur, leaving tiny droplets of water on the worn leather. It curled up instinctively, Jake's coat still wrapped around it like a fragile shield against the cold. Shutting the door, Jake slid into the driver's seat and turned on the heat. Warm air blasted through the vents, filling the car with much-needed warmth. The dog let out a faint sigh, its eyes fluttering closed, as if finally allowing itself to rest. Jake sat back, watching it for a moment. He had seen a lot in his years on the force. He had chased criminals, broken up fights, dealt with situations he'd rather forget. But this felt different. He didn't know why, but something told him that tonight, this moment, was important. That picking up this stray wasn't just an act of kindness. It was the beginning of something bigger. He just didn't know what yet. With one last glance at the sleeping dog beside him, Jake put the car in gear and pulled away from the courthouse. The snowstorm raged on outside, but inside the cruiser there was warmth. And for the first time in a long time, the stray dog wasn't alone. It didn't know it yet. But tonight, its fate had changed forever. The grand courtroom was filled with murmurs, a sea of whispers rippling through the gathered crowd. Spectators, reporters, and even seasoned legal professionals exchanged bewildered glances. A case like this had never been seen before. At the judge's bench, William Carter, a man known for his stern and methodical approach to justice, removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. His deep-set grey eyes scanned the courtroom before landing on the defendant, a German shepherd lying quietly on the polished wooden floor. He sighed. "So let me get this straight." His voice, though calm, carried an edge of incredulity. "We are holding a formal trial for a dog." The prosecutor, an older man with neatly combed hair and a crisp navy suit, adjusted his tie before responding. "Yes, Your Honor. This dog was found at the scene of an armed robbery last week. It has no identification, no registered owner. Witnesses claim it was seen near the suspect. Given the circumstances, the police believe it may have been trained as a lookout or even an accomplice." A low scoff came from the front row of the gallery. Officer Jake Donovan, sitting stiffly in his seat, clenched his jaw. His hands were balled into fists, resting on his lap. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though his voice was loud enough for those nearby to hear. The judge turned his sharp gaze toward him. "Officer Donovan, you seem to have an objection." Jake rose from his seat. "Damn right I do." His voice was firm but controlled. "This dog is no criminal. It's a stray, a starving, half-frozen stray that I found outside the courthouse the night of the storm. That's all it is." He looked down at the German shepherd, which lay motionless, its ears flicking slightly, as if listening to every word. "It wasn't helping any criminals," Jake continued. "It was just trying to survive." The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He turned to the prosecutor. "What actual evidence do we have linking this dog to the robbery?" The prosecutor cleared his throat and gestured to a detective standing nearby. The detective stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. "We reviewed security footage from the robbery," he began. "The suspect, whose face was hidden, was seen fleeing the store late at night. As he ran, this dog appeared from the shadows. Witnesses reported seeing the suspect interacting with it before disappearing into the alley." Jake's eyebrows furrowed. "Interacting how?" The detective hesitated. "It's unclear. Some say the dog was barking at the suspect. Others claim it seemed to be following him. The footage isn't definitive, but given the circumstances, it raised enough suspicion." The judge flipped through the folder, his expression unreadable. "Suspicion is not proof." The prosecutor straightened. "There's more, Your Honor." He gestured toward an officer, who brought forward an evidence bag. Inside was a torn scrap of fabric, a piece of dark material, ragged at the edges. "This was recovered near the crime scene," the prosecutor continued. "It matches the suspect's jacket, which was later found abandoned. Forensics found traces of dog saliva on it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jake narrowed his eyes. "So what? That doesn't mean the dog was working with him. If anything, it could mean— He paused, his mind suddenly racing. Could it mean the dog tried to stop the suspect? The thought struck him like lightning. He turned toward the German Shepherd, which still lay completely still. It wasn't trembling, wasn't whining, wasn't reacting aggressively. It was just watching everything. Jake knelt down beside it, lowering his voice. "Hey, buddy, is that what happened?" The dog didn't respond, of course, but its ears twitched. Jake exhaled, his frustration simmering. "This is a waste of time," he said, standing again. "You're putting a dog on trial based on circumstantial evidence. Have you considered the possibility that this dog wasn't helping the suspect, but trying to stop him?" More murmurs, more shifting glances. The judge raised a hand for silence. He studied Jake for a moment before turning to the prosecutor. "Do we have the suspect in custody?" The prosecutor nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, but he's refusing to cooperate." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "All right, here's what we're going to do. We'll adjourn for now and review this so-called evidence further. If we can't prove this dog was an accomplice beyond reasonable doubt, then this entire case is pointless." He turned to Jake. "Officer Donovan, in the meantime, the dog is in your custody." Jake blinked. "Excuse me?" The judge leaned forward. "You found it, you brought it in. Until we sort this mess out, you're responsible for it." Jake hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. But mark my words, Judge, this dog is not a criminal." The judge's expression was unreadable as he banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned." The courtroom slowly began to empty. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lawyers muttered among themselves. Jake let out a breath and looked down at the German Shepherd, who finally moved, stretching slightly, then standing beside him. It chose to stand beside him. Jake scratched the back of his head. "Well, buddy, looks like you're coming with me." The dog didn't wag its tail, didn't bark in excitement, but it followed him out, and that, somehow, meant more than words. Jake had a feeling this wasn't just about a trial. Something bigger was at play. He just didn't know what yet. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom. Judge William Carter slowly lowered his gavel, his grip tightening around the polished wooden handle. He could feel the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressing against his chest, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. The German Shepherd, still curled on the floor, barely moved. Its deep brown eyes locked onto the judge's with an expression that sent a strange chill down Carter's spine. There was something eerily familiar in those eyes, something he couldn't quite place. Then the prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, adjusting his tie, "the police have recovered additional footage from the night of the robbery. This new evidence may change the course of this trial." Carter gave a curt nod. "Proceed." The courtroom lights dimmed, and the large screen at the front flickered to life. The grainy black-and-white surveillance footage from the convenience store filled the screen. Everyone watched intently. The night of the robbery. The timestamp on the footage showed 11:47 p.m., late at night. The convenience store was nearly empty, except for a cashier standing behind the register, absent-mindedly counting bills. Then, a figure burst through the entrance. The suspect was wearing a dark hoodie, face partially obscured by shadows. In his right hand, he clutched a handgun, which he immediately aimed at the cashier. Gasps spread through the courtroom. On the screen, the cashier raised his hands in surrender as the suspect shoved a bag forward, demanding money. The cashier fumbled with the register, quickly stuffing the cash inside the bag. Then something unexpected happened. A shadow moved in the corner of the screen. The courtroom held its breath as a German Shepherd emerged from the darkness, the same dog now lying in front of them. In the footage, the dog stayed completely still, watching the suspect. Then, in one sudden burst of movement, it lunged. The courtroom gasped. The dog sank its teeth into the suspect's arm, making him stumble backward. The gun slipped from his grip, clattering onto the floor. He tried to shake the dog off, but it held firm, growling fiercely. The struggle lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. The cashier used the distraction to trigger the silent alarm, and within moments, Police sirens filled the night. The suspect yanked his arm free, shoving the dog away, and bolted out the door, vanishing into the darkness. The courtroom reacts. The video paused, frozen on the image of the dog standing in the doorway, its silhouette illuminated by the flashing police lights outside. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. He wasn't helping the suspect," someone whispered. "He was stopping him." Jake Donovan, who had remained tense throughout the video, exhaled sharply. "I told you," he muttered under his breath. "This dog is no criminal." Judge Carter stared at the frozen image, his mind reeling. But before he could speak, a uniformed detective sitting near the back of the courtroom suddenly shot up from his seat. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling. Everyone turned toward him. His eyes were wide as he pointed at the screen. "Zoom in on the suspect," he said urgently. "Enhance the footage." The technician complied, adjusting the grainy black-and-white image. The suspect's hoodie and shadows still obscured much of his face, but as the camera zoomed in, details became clearer. The shape of his jawline, the slightly unshaven stubble. And then, the technician paused the video at the exact moment the suspect glanced toward the camera. A devastating realization. A stunned silence fell over the room, because now, on the large screen in front of them, the suspect's face was visible. Judge Carter's breath caught in his throat. He felt the world tilt beneath him. His fingers went numb as he gripped the edge of his bench for support. He recognized that face. Everyone did. The armed suspect in the footage, the man the German Shepherd had attacked, was Daniel Carter, his son. The weight of truth. The courtroom erupted. Shocked whispers murmured disbelief. The prosecutor turned, his expression unreadable. Even Jake, who had been so firm in his belief in the dog's innocence, looked stunned. Judge Carter couldn't move. His hands trembled as he stared at the screen. His only child, the boy he had raised, was the very criminal standing trial through another case. And the dog he had nearly condemned, the one accused of being an accomplice, was the very creature that had tried to stop him. Carter's chest ached, a deep, consuming pain that went far beyond the walls of the courtroom. His own flesh and blood, his son. The gavel slipped from his grasp, landing on the desk with a soft thud. The German Shepherd lifted its head, gazing up at him once more, and in that moment Carter understood. This dog hadn't just been there that night. It had tried to save his son. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. It was the kind of silence that swallowed everything. The whispers, the rustling of papers, even the ticking of the grand clock mounted above the judge's bench. Judge William Carter sat frozen, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. His breath was slow, uneven. He forced himself to look at the screen again, to study the face that had just been revealed to the entire room. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a trick of the shadows. It was his son, Daniel, his only child, the boy he had once cradled in his arms, the young man he had barely spoken to in years. Carter swallowed hard, his throat dry like sandpaper. He slowly turned his gaze downward, to the German Shepherd still lying on the wooden floor before him. The dog didn't move. It just lay there, watching, waiting. For what, Carter didn't know. But in that moment, something clicked in his mind, something he had forgotten. A memory from the past. 15 years ago, the house had been warm, filled with the scent of old books and fresh coffee. Carter had been working late, as he always did, hunched over a stack of case files. Justice had no hours. Then, a soft bark. He barely looked up. Another bark, this time more persistent. With a sigh, Carter removed his glasses and turned toward the living room, where a young boy sat on the floor, his small hands buried in the golden fur of a puppy. "Daniel," Carter had said, his voice weary. "What is this?" His son, only 10 years old then, looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "His name is Max, Dad," the boy said. "I found him behind the school. He was all alone." Carter had sighed. We don't have time for a dog. Daniel's tiny arms tightened around the pup. But Dad, he needs me. There had been something in the boy's voice then, a quiet desperation. Carter had been too exhausted to see it. He had simply sighed, rubbed his temple, and muttered, "Do what you want. Just make sure he doesn't get in my way." That was the first and last time Carter had acknowledged the dog, because after that, his work consumed him. The weight of the present. Now, 15 years later, Carter felt the past crash into him like a tidal wave. The dog before him, the one on trial, the one that had attacked a robber in the dead of night. It was Max, Daniel's dog. His chest tightened. How was it possible? How had this dog, long forgotten, survived all these years? How had it found its way back here, into this courtroom, wrapped in the same tragedy that had once divided father and son? The courtroom holds its breath. Jake Donovan, who had remained silent, watching the judge's reaction, finally spoke. "Your Honor?" he asked carefully. Carter barely heard him. He was still staring at the dog, his mind unraveling. Jake exchanged glances with the prosecutor, then hesitated before stepping forward. "I don't know what's going on here," he said, lowering his voice so only the judge could hear. "But you're looking at that dog like you've seen a ghost." Carter blinked rapidly, forcing himself to breathe. He had to pull himself together. He was still the judge. He was still in control. Slowly, he straightened his posture, but when he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "This dog," he inhaled deeply. "This isn't just some stray, is it?" Jake shook his head. "No, sir, it's not." Carter turned toward the courtroom. The spectators were still frozen, watching with rapt attention, waiting to see how he would respond. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his authority. "This court needs a recess," he said firmly. He struck his gavel against the bench, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. "Court adjourned for the day." Then, without waiting for a response, he rose and walked out. Not because he wanted to, because if he stayed a second longer, the truth, the reality of what had just happened, would have shattered him completely. The cold, fluorescent light flickered in Judge William Carter's office. He sat at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed his palms against his face. The courthouse was nearly empty now. Everyone had gone home, leaving only the faint hum of the heating system and the echo of distant footsteps in the hall. But inside him, a storm was raging. The face of his son, Daniel, flashed in his mind, not as a grown man in that grainy security footage, but as the 10-year-old boy who had once looked up to him with innocent admiration. And the dog, Max. The same dog that had saved lives that night. The same dog that had been forgotten, abandoned, yet never stopped being loyal. Carter leaned back in his chair, exhaling shakily. The past was clawing its way back, unraveling every cold, calculated decision he had ever made, and for the first time in years, he let it. 10 years ago. The Carter household was never a warm home. It was a house of order, of silence. Daniel had grown up in the shadow of his father's career, a father who spoke of justice, law, and discipline, but never once asked his son if he was happy. That was why, on one fateful afternoon, Daniel came home with a puppy. It was a tiny thing, its ears too big for its head, its fur a soft mess of black and tan. It had been trembling in his arms, but the moment Carter entered the room, the boy's eyes lit up with defiance. "He's mine," Daniel had said, standing tall. "I found him at the shelter. His name is Max." Carter had barely glanced at the animal. He had case files to review, hearings to prepare for. A dog? His tone had been distant, uninterested. "Daniel, we've talked about responsibility. A pet is not a toy." "He's not a toy," the boy had insisted. "He's my friend." Carter sighed, already losing patience. "That's not how the world works, son. You can't just bring home something broken and expect it to fix itself." Daniel's small hands had tightened around Max's tiny frame. "Then maybe it's not him that needs fixing. he had whispered under his breath. Carter hadn't heard him. He had already turned away. The slow drift apart. At first, Daniel and Max were inseparable. The boy had always been quiet, but with Max he had become alive. He had taken him on walks, played with him in the backyard, whispered his secrets into the puppy's fur at night. But as the years passed, Carter noticed something shift. Daniel grew angrier, more distant. Max still followed him everywhere, still wagged his tail whenever Daniel walked into a room, but the boy had stopped noticing. By the time Daniel was 16, the walks had stopped. The laughter was gone. One evening, Carter came home to find Max alone in the backyard, curled up in the dirt beside an empty food bowl. Daniel wasn't there. The dog lifted its head as Carter approached, his tail wagging just once, as if still hoping. But Carter had walked past him without a word. He had told himself it wasn't his problem, and that was the mistake that had started it all. The night Daniel left. Daniel left home at 17. No goodbye, no explanations, just a slammed door and silence. Max had waited at the front steps that whole night, ears perked, staring down the street, waiting for his boy to return. But he never did, and by the time Carter finally noticed, finally realized the dog hadn't moved, it was too late. Max was gone. He had disappeared into the city, swallowed by the streets. Carter had barely given it a thought. Until tonight, until that courtroom, until that security footage, where a full-grown German shepherd lunged at a masked man and tore a gun from his grip. A dog who had every right to hate the world, every reason to turn its back on its old life. Yet still, when the moment came, it had chosen to protect the boy it once loved, the boy who abandoned him. The present, inescapable truth. Carter snapped back to reality, his hands shaking as he gripped his desk. It was too much, the irony, the cruelty of it all. His son had run from him, the dog had been abandoned. But now, somehow, fate had tied them together again. And he, the man who prided himself on delivering justice, had nearly condemned the one creature that had stayed true. His breath shuddered. He wiped a hand over his face, trying to suppress the nausea rising in his stomach. What had he done? The courtroom, a heavy silence. The next morning, the courtroom was silent. The press was there. The lawyers, the jury, the onlookers, everyone sat tensely, waiting for the trial to resume. Carter stepped onto the bench, but something in him had changed. The man who sat there wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a father who had failed his son. And now, he was staring at the only soul who had never given up on Daniel. Max. The dog lay on the courtroom floor, calm as ever. It didn't flinch, it didn't look away, and Carter knew. Max recognized him, not as a judge, not as a stranger, but as the father of the boy it had once belonged to. The courtroom was heavy with silence. It was not the silence of anticipation, nor the awkward hush before a heated debate. It was the kind of silence that weighed on the soul, the kind that only appeared when lives were about to change forever. Judge William Carter slowly rose from his bench. His hands, which had once been so steady in delivering justice, trembled slightly. But when he spoke, his voice, though raw with emotion, held unwavering authority. The decision that changed everything. This court, Carter began, his voice carrying across the room, has spent the last few days deliberating a case that, by all conventional standards, should not exist. He turned his gaze towards the German shepherd, who lay still on the wooden floor, head slightly tilted, watching. Max is not a criminal, Carter continued, his jaw tightening. He did not assist a crime. He did not act with malice. In fact, he did what many of us in this room failed to do. He tried to stop it. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jake Donovan exhaled sharply, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since the trial began. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, but he did not object, because the truth was undeniable. Carter turned toward his son, who sat in the defendant's seat, his head bowed, wrists bound in cuffs. "Daniel Carter." Carter's voice softened, but it did not waver. "You have broken the law. You have committed a crime that this court cannot overlook." Daniel flinched, but did not look up. "You will face justice," Carter continued, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. "But you will not face it alone." Daniel's shoulders shook slightly. For the first time he lifted his head. His father, a man he thought had given up on him years ago, was looking at him not just as a judge, but as a father. Carter inhaled deeply. "The law will hold you accountable for what you have done." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But I will not abandon you." The room was utterly still. Daniel's throat bobbed as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. Maybe he didn't deserve them yet, but maybe, just maybe, there was still time. A new home for Max. Carter took a slow, deliberate breath before shifting his gaze toward Jake Donovan. "Officer Donovan," he said, regaining his composure, "this court recognizes that Max has no known owner and was abandoned years ago. Since he is no longer under investigation, I am authorizing you to take custody of him." Jake's eyes widened slightly, but he recovered quickly. Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly, nodding. "I'd be honored." Carter's lips pressed together as if he wanted to say more, but instead he simply inclined his head. Jake turned to Max, who was now looking directly at him. A moment passed. Then Jake crouched down beside him, running his fingers gently through the thick, slightly rough fur. "You hear that, buddy?" Jake murmured, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're coming home." Max tilted his head, as if processing the words. Then, for the first time since stepping foot into that cold courtroom, the dog moved forward, toward Jake. He licked his hand, a slow, deliberate motion, not out of obligation, not because he had to, but because somehow he knew. For the first time in years he was home. A new beginning. As the gavel came down, finalizing the court's ruling, a strange feeling settled over the room. Relief, hope, a sense that, for all the pain and all the mistakes, maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Max was no longer astray. Daniel was no longer completely alone. And Judge Carter? He was no longer just a man who upheld the law. He was a father, one who, for the first time in far too long, was willing to fight for the people and the creatures that mattered most. Not all encounters in life are coincidences. Some are destined, woven into the fabric of time, waiting for the right moment to reveal their purpose. Max had been abandoned. He had wandered the streets alone, enduring hunger, storms, and the indifference of the world. He had every reason to turn bitter, to lose faith, to forget those who left him behind. But he didn't. When fate placed him in front of the man who had once been his whole world, he did not run. He did not seek revenge. Instead, he protected him, because love, true, unwavering love, is not erased by pain. It is not destroyed by betrayal. It endures. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Loyalty is unbreakable. Even after years of suffering, Max's loyalty never wavered. He proved that true devotion is not conditional, it is eternal. Forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. Daniel had turned his back on Max. He had lost himself in his own darkness. But forgiveness found him, through the one soul he had wronged the most. Love changes fate. In the end, it was not judgment that saved Daniel. It was not a courtroom, a verdict, or a sentence. It was love. The love of a father willing to try again, the love of a dog who refused to give up, and the love of a man, Jake, who offered Max a second chance at a real home. Have you ever witnessed a story of unwavering loyalty? Like this. Maybe you have. Maybe you know of a dog who waited for its owner to return, even when the world told it to move on. Maybe you know of a person who forgave, even when forgiveness seemed impossible. If you have, share it with us. because the world needs more stories like this, stories that remind us of the goodness that still exists, of the love that never dies. A blessing for all who wait for a miracle. May God bless you. May He watch over the faithful souls who wait in the cold, who long for kindness, who refuse to give up hope. And may we all remember, in our own lives, to be a little more like Max, to love without conditions, to forgive when it is hardest, and to never stop believing in second chances. If this story touched your heart, share it, because somewhere out there, someone or some little soul is still waiting for their miracle.